Welcome to the Navigating Disruption podcast. I'm your host, Shaquille Barmel. I'm a coach, consultant, and speaker, and I help leaders, entrepreneurs, and sales professionals make an impact through improved performance. In this podcast, I share insights and interviews with interesting leaders to define practical lessons that you can use to make an impact in the face of uncertainty. We are proud to be brought to you by the Summit Group. We help companies increase revenue and deepen customer relationships by moving from sales excellence to authentic business relevance through engaging learning experiences. I have been doing much thinking about the power for good, as well as the danger of social media, online searches, online shopping, and digital transactions. On one hand, the web has empowered our social connections, fueled small business survival, and the flexibility to work from home. On the other hand, we have experienced the impact of breaches of data privacy, the spread of misinformation, and the ability to mobilize some terrible forces in society. John Lloyd, head of campaigns at Mozilla Foundation, joins me in this conversation to share his perspectives on this important topic that has been unfolding before our eyes. Mozilla Foundation is a global nonprofit dedicated to putting people in control of their online experience and shaping the future of the web for public good. Mozilla's for-profit business owns the Firefox browser. Our conversation went well beyond this original topic as we dived into leadership, empathy, and trust. Now, I recorded this conversation early in the year, just after the holidays in January, so we'll be referencing some events in the world around that time. Enjoy the conversation. John, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Really good. Good. You have I assume, a quiet holiday.
Yeah, of course. Lockdown,
Yeah.
COVID. That's our life.
We're 2 weeks into 2021, and for me, it actually doesn't feel like much of a new year, really. It's just a continuation.
Yeah, it's really 2020 continued plus some extra drama right at the end of this Trump presidency. So
absolutely.
Yeah,
Where are you, John? Where are you in the world?
I'm in London in the UK.
Yeah, and do you live right in town, or whereabouts in London?
Kind of. If you know the city well enough, I'm sort of a couple of kilometers north of the old city of London, Liverpool Street area.
Okay, very good. And how long have you lived there?
I've been in London for 7 years now.
Okay. Oh, wow. So quite a while now. Where are some of the places you've lived in your life, in your adult life?
Well, in my adult life, well, I'm originally from New Zealand, and I spent my early 20s there, and then I lived in Australia for a summer as well while I was at university. I spent about 4 years in Canada in total, and then moved to London. So
yeah, very good. Well, one of the wonderful things about the internet is that we were able to connect virtually with people all over the world. And so you and I got to know each other actually, I think, either just before or just post kind of the pandemic last year. And we've been able to stay connected across the ocean through the power of Zoom. So I'm grateful for having gotten to know you. But one of the things in all our conversations, we didn't really talk a lot about what you do and the world you're exposed to in the world. Let's say you're trying to change a little bit. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to get into that conversation. So, John, tell me kind of who you work for, what you do, what you're trying to do in your work there.
Sure, yeah. So I work for Mozilla, and the overall mission of Mozilla ultimately is to make sure that the internet is a force for good.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a funny organization because it's actually two organizations that straddle two industries. So on the one side, you've got the corporation who try and live the Mozilla mission, and they do that through like building products. So Mozilla makes the Firefox browser, which is like our most well-known product, plus a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you've also got the foundation, and that's where I work. And we try and live that mission through like research, insights, bring community together through events like we've got a Mozilla Festival, for example.
Yeah.
We support independent experts as well who do a lot of like positive things for the internet. We do that through like fellowships and an awards program.
Yeah.
And then there's also our advocacy work, and I fall into that last category. So I'm the head of campaigns at Mozilla.
Okay, very cool. So Mozilla, so you talk about two parts of the organization. The for-profit side, everybody knows Firefox. What do you think is the reason the customers that use Firefox choose Firefox over other browsers? What's the unique advantage of it?
Sure. Well, the way that we've always kind of positioned ourselves as a privacy first organization, one that really puts people at the front and center of what we try to
Yeah.
do. And we've got this vision for the internet that's very
Yeah.
inclusive, and really like we see the internet as enabling new opportunities for learning and building a sense of shared humanity and all of those kind of things. So we try and build that into the browser and other products, and
Yeah.
Firefox is an example of that.
Yeah.
The kind of origins of it were as an alternative to Internet Explorer at the time
Yeah.
in the early 2000s. And it was sort of a bit of a period in the late 2000s where Google started shipping Chrome as its own browser, and we've lost a lot of share, unfortunately, because of that. But yeah, we try to put people's privacy first.
Yeah.
And
So that's your that's your unique approach to the marketplace. And so those that kind of are with you, most of those people have identified that as one of their key priorities, is protecting their privacy.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't want to be sharing your data with big tech companies, it's
Yeah.
definitely the browser to choose.
And then the foundation has emerged from that as, I guess, a mechanism or driving a movement to bring that awareness to other organizations, consumers more broadly, and influence the way other tech companies care for their clients' privacy. Is that right?
Well, the genesis is actually pretty interesting. So the foundation came first as
Oh,
a holding organization for the browser, and then they made the corporation explicitly so the browser could make a profit. And then the foundation's mission is now to kind of put those principles of the Mozilla Manifesto in place. So
that's
foundation
incredible.
owns the corporation, yeah.
Wow, I did not realize that. That is pretty cool. And that is a very different way of thinking about doing business and making money in this day and age. Well, I
Right.
want to dive a bit more into that work. But before I do that, my listeners know that I'm a big believer in the power of being nostalgic. And so I want to go as far back as your memory goes back and your memory serves. Is there a story or a time in your childhood or adolescence that you kind of keeps coming back to your mind and actually influences kind of how you conduct yourself in your leadership?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if it's necessarily my child. Well, actually, yeah, I've got one from my childhood. So I had a teacher for a couple of years in a row in primary school, a woman called Mrs. Mason.
Okay.
And she was like our class's personal Mr. Rogers. She was just one of those people that's so incredibly warm and like very human, but also just incredibly effective at what she did.
Yeah.
She didn't suffer any fools, and could definitely be strict when she needed to be.
Yeah.
And yeah, I learned a few things from her. And one of them I hadn't really put into words until I was talking with my dad last year or the year before.
Uh-huh.
But the philosophy behind it is really like knowing isn't understanding. So the gist of that is when you're learning you, especially something a bit complex,
Yeah.
shears help us understand the why behind what it was. So really what was going on in the background of the thing. So rather than just say teaching us a formula and then making us burn the formula into our brains, she would really make us understand what was going on. So
Ah,
the formula just logically made sense. You understood what those components were and how they
yeah.
work. And
Yeah.
it's something that I always try to do when I'm working with a team, just giving a bit of background into why we do things a certain way or how we approach issues, because I think that extra context, that like understanding is so critical to success in the team, especially if you want your team to be quite independent
Yeah.
and like free thought. I think there's another thing as well around how she handled mistakes.
Yeah.
So everybody knows this. When you've stuffed up, you know it. Everybody knows it.
Yeah.
And she had this way of acknowledging mistakes without castigating you for them. So it was really looking at focusing how the mistake was made in the first place and making sure you knew what steps to take so you didn't make that mistake again. I really, yeah, and I totally agree with this, and I
Hmm.
don't think going after someone is really appropriate in any situation, but really not like in a workplace, like yelling at someone for making a mistake. It's entirely learned behavior.
It sounds like Mrs. Mason would make a great CEO today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. She's fantastic. And I can't imagine having the emotional energy for being that compassionate, but still like so stern to a class of 8 and 9 year olds.
Yeah.
It's just, it's remarkable. I actually sent her a thank you note when I was about 25.
Wow, amazing. I know I have some teachers and principals that listen to this podcast, and it's just a great opportunity just to let teachers know what a difference they make. It's one of those professions that there's not a lot of glamour in it, but yet the impact of what you do for a child and what that child goes on to do is really significant and multiplying. And just your example and story is just speaks to that, right? So understand the why behind the what. Simon Sinek has made a lot of money selling books just talking about starting with the why and understanding the why and the kind of understanding the reason for mistake. Again, that's Japanese management methods, right? Deming, and well, Deming is American, but the Japanese kind of took over that way of thinking about it in manufacturing and Toyota and other companies, and all from elementary school teacher. Amazing. Thanks for sharing that story. I also remember that in our conversations last year, you were talking about how you were running sessions with your team, strategy sessions, and you did take some time to make sure they understood the why behind certain things in the business and in the organization to actually help them be much more able to contribute to the strategy, and you gave them that ownership to contribute to the strategy. It's helpful for me now to understand the teacher that was behind your way of thinking about that. Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. I think it can be so hard coming into a new job without any context and
Mhm.
having that a bit of history into why you're doing the work that you do
Yeah.
and the way that you do it
Yeah.
is just it unlocks so much.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
yeah.
John, can you tell me the story of how you came to doing the job you're doing right now? What brought you here? What drew you here?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I totally fell into this career path. So probably about 12 years ago now, I fell in love and just on a whim moved to Canada.
Yeah.
It was sort of right at that deepest point of the 2008 crash in the
Wow.
fallout period. And I managed to get a job at a fundraising agency doing some marketing, which is what I'd gone and done at university. And
Yeah.
then just over time, I started doing more and more actual fundraising consulting because fundraising is a type of marketing. And
Yeah.
eventually, I kind of transitioned and I started working for Amnesty International's cyber team, as it was
Mm,
called then, but really like a digital team embedded. And it was kind of across a bunch of business functions. So it was my main work introduction to campaigning and advocacy.
mm.
And then I've really been doing some combination of fundraising, campaigning, marketing, advocacy since then.
And so the work that you took you to London with Mozilla Foundation, were you already, so you were already doing fundraising marketing and advocacy marketing. Was the move over to London with Mozilla related to the cause, related to anything you'd done before, or was the cause new to you?
I'd actually moved to London with another organization called Some of Us, which is a campaigning organization as well.
Yeah.
And I primarily did fundraising there. So I was a fundraising and campaigns director. And yeah, I guess Mozilla is one thing that really stood out to me, I guess, for when I took the role at Mozilla was really, I guess, the importance of the internet and
Mm,
everything that we do. So, yeah, I guess I've been seeing in my own work the role of the internet in helping make or prevent change from happening.
Mhm,
So one of the biggest barriers, I think, to real action on, say, like climate change
mhm.
is the fact that you've got these giant lobby groups flinging misinformation about climate change, like all over the place. So the role of misinformation isn't really to get people to believe the misinformation
Mhm.
itself necessarily, but it's to get people to really doubt the truth. So when you've got climate scientists saying, we've only got 10 years to get CO2 levels below 350 parts per million, or the planet is irreversibly screwed.
Yeah.
People just kind of hear that and add it to the pile of like, well, could it be true? So
Mm.
I've been seeing a lot of that popping up and just realize how important the internet was in our daily lives.
Yeah.
And so when I started working at Mozilla, it was kind of difficult to get people interested in these like digital rights issues. And
Yeah.
I started working at Mozilla before the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and that happened at Facebook. And it was just kind of a different beast. I think people didn't entirely understand like just how egregious data use has
Yeah.
been by major platforms like Facebook or Google or
Yeah.
any other social platform, and really ended up being a bit of a blessing in disguise because the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that is,
Yeah.
because since then it's really brought a lot of these issues which affect our daily lives
Yeah.
really into the public consciousness. And I think there's been more and more of a drumbeat of that over time, especially with the US election happening
Yeah.
and documentaries like The Social Dilemma. People are really understanding that what's happening online and online actions can have
Yeah.
real world consequences.
Yeah. I did just watch Social Dilemma over the holidays. And on one hand, I'm really glad I watched. On the other hand, I'm very afraid, much more afraid now than I ever was to have pioneers of the tech industry, pioneers at some of the big platforms that we all use now daily, in some senses, without being direct about it, saying that they screwed up. They didn't realize the repercussions of some of the things they were unleashing, and they are worried and fearful now, which partly led me to want to have this conversation with you to just get your perspective on what's at stake for us, what's at stake for leaders if we don't just learn to embrace a bit more critical thinking and responsibility when it comes to the way we use the internet for business. What do you
Oh,
think's at
what's
stake? It's a big question, I know. So just
yeah.
riff for me, but just kind of what do you think? How do you see the world of business unfolding if we don't change our ways?
I think everything's at stake.
Right.
The way that we think about everything at the moment needs to change. It's so driven by a single bottom line, and we really need to be thinking about some of the triple bottom line kind of idea.
Yeah.
So we need to be thinking about the impact that our actions, our collective actions, are having on people,
Yeah.
and also on our planet. And I think it requires a fundamental change in the way that we think. So I think the way that we look at hierarchy and input from different people in decision making, the way that we're impacting our communities, like how much we pay our staff, all of those kind of aspects need to be seriously looked at because we've got rising inequality.
Yeah.
And as a business, I really find it fascinating that it's not raising alarm bells that the cost of living for an everyday person is getting out of control, where countries like Canada or New Zealand or Australia or the UK, or specifically London, where the cost of housing can be over 50% of somebody's income. And if you're a business owner, why wouldn't you want somebody to do something about that? Because
Yeah.
that means less disposable income for your business.
Hmm.
And if you're, yeah, it just seems wild that we're willing to look at this very short term measure to address a long term
Mm-hmm.
business prospect. We should be thinking in terms of 3 to 5 years. And as that relates to the internet, I
Hmm.
think. the businesses that have best adapted with the COVID crisis right now are the ones that had already let their staff work from home in distributed teams and
Yeah.
already were using software like Zoom or Slack to allow
Yeah.
collaboration from different places. And the businesses that struggled the most were very old school, very top down, refused to let their employees work from home, had a very strong hierarchical structure, and didn't allow employees to be making decisions for
Yeah.
themselves or for the good of the business. So I truly believe, I think everything's at stake if we don't start to embrace this change.
Well, what I find interesting, what you just said about businesses and those that were able to manage the transition and this time, were those that were already willing to embrace technology, willing to embrace people working from home. Whereas the businesses that struggled, and I'm thinking a lot about small, medium-sized enterprises. I don't know what it's like in your part of the world, but here in Canada, it's a very, very large percentage of business owners actually had not embraced doing business digitally, e-commerce, and using the internet for marketing or demand generation. And I've talked to a few entrepreneurs about that in other podcasts, but some of them have pivoted and some of them have gotten really good really fast. And of course, the Facebooks and the Googles have offered a lot of knowledge and training, and a lot of people are kind of helping small businesses kind of pivot. The Shopifys of the world are helping small businesses become much better at doing business using the internet. But part of me is wondering is if that push to catch up very quickly for the purposes of generating the revenue. And I'm a big proponent of small businesses pivoting and embracing technology to drive their livelihoods, pay their employees, contribute to their communities. But what's the downside of moving so quickly to embrace those technologies?
Well, I think fundamentally it sort of comes down to an issue of trust in a way,
Mm,
where businesses that trust their employees in terms of doing good work, being self driven, making decisions, all of those kind of things, those businesses that have a high level of trust and put a lot of effort into hiring people and all of that, they're also the ones that are doing the best
hmm
and are able to adapt because they're more willing to get ideas from across the business
hmm
and they're more willing to embrace a new way of doing things.
hmm
I think the downside is if you're the type of leader that needs to be in control all the time and likes to micromanage and all of that kind of thing, I don't think there's really a place for that type of business owner
hmm
in the business of the future. Then there might be in a very small business, but if you actually want to be growing, I think it's really critical to make sure that you put a lot of effort in the front end. So how you hire people and how you onboard them,
hmm
and then I guess it's that thing where I really try to give my team the trust and space to do their
Yeah,
best work.
yeah,
Like I've seen through people who've managed me, I think like micromanaging stifles creativity
yeah,
and also lowers trust on both sides by quite a lot.
yeah,
Staff will hesitate to come to you if there are any problems because
yeah,
they think they might get in trouble for it.
yeah,
And so, what I try to do is I spend more of my energy on setting expectations and then delegating really strongly.
yeah,
So people know what we as a team are trying to achieve.
yeah.
There's that old Ogilvy saying, right? It's like, give me
Yeah,
the freedom.
the advertising. Ogilvy's the advertising
Yeah.
guru. Okay, yeah.
So he's David Ogilvy, I think he
Yeah.
had that saying, give me the freedom of a tightly defined brief. So it's like setting those boundaries for people and then checking in with them once a week.
Yeah.
Like when you're checking in, focusing on open ended questions, stuff that'll really help them remove
Yeah.
doubts about a project or barriers or really building that trust relationship between the two. Like you've hired people for a reason and it's your
Yeah.
job to let them do their best work.
Yeah.
And we all kind of win in that side. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, John, it sounds like you and your team have actually had a good working experience this past year.
Yeah, I think as good as it can get. Lucky enough to have already been a distributed team. So no two people on my team live in the same place.
Yeah.
And one thing that we've really missed actually is that in-person time. I
Mm,
think the in-person time is really critical for having those like strategy setting
yeah.
sessions and those things that take a bit more energy, because doing that over Zoom for hours at a time, it's just so draining
Yeah.
that we've really missed out on that. But
Yeah.
yeah, we were sort of lucky enough to already be working in this kind of way anyway. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I also previously worked with a nonprofit before, I mean, just as recently as a year and a half ago. And one of the things I found, I had part of my team that's distributed throughout the country. They were located in the markets where we had volunteers and campaigns we were running, live campaigns. And then we had a group of staff that was in headquarters with me here in Ottawa. And as much as we tried, there was always this little feeling of us and them, that the people working remotely felt like they weren't understood and the challenges of working remotely weren't understood, and they didn't feel as engaged with the team as they wanted to. And then you've got the folks in head office that weren't really able to empathize with the folks in the field, and at the same time felt like the folks in the field thought they had it easy because they're at head office, right? And what happened and what I observed happen when the world went to all working remotely, it it evened the playing field because everybody was in the same boat. And I do think that led to some better understanding and empathy. I believe it did. And so the fact that you already worked that way is kind of interesting. But I don't know if you noticed anything like that, because you probably had some people that you worked closely with, but some of your people were distributed.
Sure, yeah. And I think we have sort of seen a bit of that too, where people that work in offices sort of report greater job
Yeah.
satisfaction than people who work remotely. And I think part of it is if you have a meeting in an office with someone else and there's a disagreement in the meeting, when you're in an office, you have that aspect of everybody walks out of the meeting room and you're like, hey, mate, would you like a cup of tea? And you're like, oh, okay, everything's fine. Like, I thought they were pissed off at me and actually it's all right.
So true.
So you miss out on that when you just shut the Zoom window and
Yeah.
then you have to sit there and think about it. And it's like, is Shaquille mad at me? Was
Yeah.
it something I said? And was that interpreted the wrong way? And I did not say anything. And I think you can kind of get in your own head a little bit.
Yeah.
And we're, we're very human people. Like humans are so social. And one thing that I really try to do to replicate a bit of the in-person time. So when I check in on my direct reports or facilitate a meeting, I generally always try and start with a bit of small talk. So like I know small talk has a pretty bad rap, but I also think it's super underestimated in terms of reducing that barrier between
Yeah.
people. So like to be honest, the main reason I started doing it is because I just like people and I find it interesting to hear about what they're up to or what they're doing. And I had some feedback a few years ago that made me really stop and think about that small talk a little bit more. So essentially, like the gist of the feedback was that it had made this person who works remotely feel like a human at work, not just like a cog in the machine that was there to do work for us.
Mm.
And when I realized that, well, when I read that rather, I realized that, like, yeah, I personally find it really abrupt when I get into a meeting and people just jump straight into the work, and especially calls over video. If you join and everyone sits in silence and then the facilitator comes in and it's like, right, okay. And so I started thinking about it more after that, and I realized that a side effect was when you engage in that small talk, you can very quickly discover how someone's feeling
Mm.
as they're coming into the meeting.
Mhm.
So sometimes somebody could be in a really bad mood and you can get a flavor of that, and then it sets the tone on how you approach the meeting and talk about the work and talk about their performance or anything like that. It just brings that empathy into work, which I think is so critical. And
Yeah.
sometimes I try and turn it around if they're in a bad mood, or try and like really go for it if everyone was in a great mood. But
Yeah.
you know, and sometimes it was successful, sometimes not so much. But I think you've got to make that effort and you've got to really try and have that humanity,
Yeah.
especially working remotely right now.
Yeah, I so agree with you. It's so interesting when you put it that way. I hadn't thought about it. When I used to do team meetings in live settings, I would question myself sometimes if we were having just a little bit too much fun at the beginning of the meeting, right? I'd come in with a story or do this or that. And somebody else would be talking about something that happened on the weekend. And there would be times that I'd wonder whether, okay, should we just get to it because, everybody's got busy schedules. And now it's almost like in a virtual world, you just want to bask in a little bit more of that. What you talk about, it's just being a little bit more social, capturing a little bit of what people are going through, what's going on in their day and their weekend, because you want to make up for the fact that you're not running into the hallways and having time to chat and do all of that. But at the same time, John, here's what I'm wrapping my mind around, because one of the things, because I also work in enabling and supporting salespeople and account managers in my work, is that I'm finding that there's two sides. There is what you do with your team in the office and at work virtually to engage more socially, and what leaders do with their teams online to just make sure everybody's doing okay. But then when you go and actually speak to a customer, it doesn't necessarily translate, because sometimes the customer is better served with, let's get to the point as quickly as possible. Let's figure out what we need to do to solve the problem, and then let's each move on to our day. And so I'm wondering, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm wondering if there's kind of a dichotomy here, is what you need to do to be with your team, and then what you need to do to respect the time of your customers. Because if you spend way too much time trying to do the type of rapport building you would do in live meetings in the virtual world, I wonder whether you'd actually test your customers' patience. I don't know the answer, but that's something that's on my mind these days.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I think there are a lot of parallels between fundraising and sales, and
Mhm.
that really you're trying to get people to part with their money.
Yeah.
And with fundraising, the thing that you're selling is ultimately like a nice feeling.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's what they're giving money to is kind of helping them fulfill their dream in the world. So the thing that you're selling is kind of that, like
Absolutely.
we're making your vision for the world come true.
I buy that.
But you're still having to sell that idea.
Yeah.
And any successful sales or fundraising or anything like that really does rely on building that relationship and specifically understanding the other person's needs.
Hmm.
Like you need to be naturally pretty inquisitive and really focus it on the person making the purchase,
Right.
right? And how do you do that? Well, you have to ask some questions and get to know them. And you get to know people through small talk. It's
Yeah.
like, as you were saying, with the kind of being worried a bit sometimes about having too much fun at the beginning of the meeting.
Yeah.
Well, that's team building, isn't it?
Yeah, it
And
is.
it's the same when you're in sales. If you do a bit of that kind of chat, if you're the kind of person that is really like emotionally switched on, they can be giving you clues about what's important to them, what values they hold,
Absolutely.
like what happened in the news and how are they talking about that. All of those kind of things,
Yeah.
like you should be taking note of those
I think
and
you're
really
right.
remembering them. And people appreciate it if you go back and you're like, hey, how was that fishing trip? Or
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you're right. Ultimately, I think you're right. I just wonder if there's an extra space to just make sure you know where the other person's at. You might be in a conversation with somebody where they've got 20 Zoom meetings in a day, and that in this particular conversation, you might be at a place where you want to get a bit social and dive in deep. But just because of when you've caught them in the day, they're not in that place. And if you try to, you kind of have to, it's kind of do unto others as they want to have done unto them at that particular time. It's just being able to sense what's the right zone. And I think our skills at picking up those signals have to get more and more refined. I think you're right. The general tendency should be to lean in a bit more, to care more, to understand more and know more, with a little bit of a caveat that is to, let's make sure that's what the other person needs right now and
yeah.
they want right now. So I think we're both somewhere in the zone of being right. From this conversation, we started off talking about data and privacy and embracing technology, but also being cautious. And then you talked about trust of your employees and knowing that they will do the right thing and not micromanaging them, but setting them up with the right parameters. So I almost wonder if you have to run on two speeds when it comes to trust. Yes, trust your people, but also have a little bit of a healthy skepticism and lack of trust maybe on the way data is being used in your world and in the business and in social media, and just be a little bit more cautious. You have to embrace technology because that's the way the world runs, but you also have to protect yourself a little bit. And it's kind of like what Mrs. Mason taught you is go underneath the surface a little bit and understand what's going on behind the scenes and be a bit more critical. I guess that's my training from watching Social Dilemma a little bit, is just think twice sometimes about what you put out in the world, what personal information you put out in the world. Would that be fair? Trust operates on two levels, high trust for your people, but just being a little bit more cautious on what you put out in the world, kind of for everybody to see.
Sure, yeah. I think trust is sort of, it's an interesting thing. I can't remember if I've spoken to you about this before, but there's this thing called the trust equation, which I read about a few years ago. I think I sent.
But talk to us about it. I think that was really cool.
Yeah, so essentially, like the way that people think about trust can kind of be summed up by this equation. So if you remember high school math,
Yeah.
you've got the equation's made up of these four variables. So you've got credibility, reliability, and intimacy kind of on the top of this equation, and you add them all up. And then on the bottom, so you're dividing it by self-orientation.
Okay, let's slow down and do that again, because I'm sure we lost a lot of people when we said high school math. So let's make sure that we go back. So you're basically, it's kind of like a numerator and denominator, right?
Yeah.
And the
Yep.
numerator, the equation of the numerator is what?
It's credibility,
Yeah.
reliability,
Yeah.
and intimacy
And
on the
intimacy
top.
on the top.
And then you divide that all by self-orientation. And so when we're talking about credibility, it has to do with what we're saying. So it might be, I trust what Shaquille says about intellectual property. He's very credible on that subject.
Yeah.
Reliability has to do with actions. So could say, if he says he'll deliver this product tomorrow, I trust him. He's a dependable guy.
Yeah.
And the intimacy is that kind of safety or security that you feel when you entrust someone with something. So it could be like, oh, I trust Shaquille with that information. He's never violated my confidentiality before, and I don't think he would embarrass me. So really what you do when you're thinking about your interactions with people is all of those things kind of have a figure to them. And you could assume and you could assign an actual figure to all of these things, but just roughly adding it up, whether it's high or low.
Yeah.
And so really what you want is that top line to be the biggest number as possible.
Okay.
Then remember, because we're dividing it, the denominator on the bottom is self-orientation.
Yeah.
So that's actually people's focus, a person's focus. So if your focus is primarily on you, that's completely different to if the focus is on me, right? And so I could say, well, I don't really trust Shaquille on this deal. I don't think he cares enough about me. He's focused more on what he's going to get out of it.
Right.
Or, you know, like, I don't really trust him. I think he's more concerned about how he's going to look out of this deal than unless he's not really paying attention to what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think in every scenario, it comes down to trust, right? So when we're looking at trust between, if you're selling a product to somebody, you want to make sure that all those things, your credibility, your reliability, and your intimacy, in this case, it's kind of the relationship that you build up with people over time. Yeah. So the people you would rate highest for intimacy would be like your parents or your wife or someone like that, right?
Yeah.
And the people that you rate lowest on intimacy would be like somebody that you bumped into at the supermarket.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know that person at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when we're thinking about like the relationship that we have with social platforms, for example,
right,
that self-orientation on the bottom,
yeah,
when we're thinking about like, we're giving our data to these people.
Yeah.
that self-orientation is actually, they're in it for them, and they've shown that again and again through their actions, especially with the run up to the US election.
Yeah.
They made changes in that which was, they had said would reduce harm and were shown to reduce harm. But then what did they do after the election? They took the changes away, they reversed them all. And so they're like, we know that people will be harmed by our algorithm making these decisions, but we are willing to make that sacrifice because we make more money out of it. So the self orientation is very high for a social platform. The credibility and the reliability, like, it's like, well, I don't believe what Facebook says because they've told us a lot of things in the past and they haven't delivered on them. I don't trust that they're going to do what they say. And that intimacy is, well, I don't really have much of a relationship with that company.
Yeah.
And so all of those things on the top are low and the self orientation on the bottom is really high. So
Wow.
if you remember high school math, like, that means that that trust is going to end up being quite low. But
Yeah.
if you think about some of those relationships where you have the highest levels of trust, so usually a parent or a best friend or
Yeah. Yeah.
a partner or someone like that, like, you believe that they're going to do what they say. You have a really strong sense of safety and security. That level of intimacy is really high. And you trust that their self orientation, they actually want what's best for you, right? And so that's how I kind of think about trust, and especially these relationships with tech platforms with our data. Like,
Yeah.
my trust in most tech platforms is pretty low because I think they don't deliver on what they say. I don't have much of a relationship with them personally. And their orientation is purely on making a profit for themselves rather than the good of the world. So,
Yeah. Wow.
yeah.
That is a really powerful way of breaking it down. And I think that is applicable to so many things in our world. So if you are in a relationship with somebody that's important to you and you feel like they're not trusting you or there's something just not quite working in the relationship, doing that analysis, right, with that formula is a great way to kind of dissect where something might be going wrong and what it is about yourself that you might be able to modify or change in order to influence the quality of that relationship. And then you can also then apply it to, gosh, your engagement with technology and media and social media, and to think about, one, I guess if you're a business person and you have some form of digital engagement for your customers, is to think about what their perception of trust is in the platform you've created. And then also, if you are engaging with social media, how to think about your willingness to share information. That was really powerful. I think that was the best part of this conversation, John. And we had talked about this before, but not to this level of depth. So thank you to sharing that. Now, is there some place that people can go to learn more about that? What sources of information or places have you drawn those insights from?
I remember reading a blog about this, and I can't remember exactly who wrote it, but it was very much focused on those personal relationships, the
Right.
ones that you would have with a loved one or another individual. And I really thought about it and realized you can apply that into an organizational type of space.
Right.
So I wrote a little bit about it on my personal blog. And what's the best way to do that? I could send you the link and you can put that up with the.
Yeah, I can put in the show notes, or we could just tell people what's the search term. How can they find? Well, this is a good place to pause for a second and say, if people are interested in what you are talking about, interested in you, where can they find you?
Well, I've got a website called fundraisingIsawesome.com,
That's great.
and you can just search for the trust equation on there. I think the title of the article is something like "The Trust Equation Will Make or Break Your Fundraising." But yeah, it's fundraising focused, but I think it applies to
Applies.
most relationships that you'll have in your life. Yeah.
Well, people that are listening can pick it up just from this, and I will put it in the show notes so that people can go to that link if they want to learn more about that. John, going forward, we're recording this the day before the inauguration in the US. It's a bunch of, I don't want to say craziness going on out there because it is crazy. It is crazy. But at the same time, what we've seen released is a bunch of pent up feelings that a lot of people living in the US have had. And whether you agree with what's happening or not, it's created a lot of turmoil and havoc. It's part of the business landscape, part of the leadership landscape that we will be facing amongst all the other challenges, climate change and coming through the pandemic and social inequality and all of that. We're living in a volatile world right now. What's your thought? What's your advice to leaders? And there's so many things that we can talk about, but what's top of mind for you for leaders in this kind of turbulent time?
Oh, yeah. I think there's probably a few things. So I don't think the US situation or things like Brexit just came out of nowhere. And it's not just the internet. I think Trump, Boris here, they aren't the first politicians to use the internet to grow violence and hate and reinforce white supremacy and all that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
what we really need is solutions that aren't going to start when the damage has already been done. So I think, again, it's having that forward focus, thinking about really the kind of things that need to be put in place now to prevent this stuff from
Right,
happening again in the future.
right.
When we're thinking about the next few years, like what I would really like to see, especially in the online ad space, I guess, is like we need some transparency
Hmm.
into who's paying for online ads, how much they're paying, who they target with them, and probably some transparency into recommendation systems. So those are the algorithms that determine what content to show each user and what gets amplified and who sees it. And
Hmm.
we need transparency into that so experts can do proper analysis.
Mm.
Like we need to give those researchers proper access right now so they can make those do those studies and figure out how to improve things. And then I'd really like to see us amplifying factual voices and having those like turned on by default just to help fight all this information that we're seeing all the time. The wildest part about this whole situation that we're in right now is this really came about because big companies just wanted to sell more ads.
Yeah.
And it's that simple. And so it's going to take more than just deplatforming Trump or someone to do that. I think we need to take a pretty serious look at the business model of the internet. And if you're a business owner,
Yeah.
the kind of platforms that you're willing to fund, where you're willing to place your ads and really being on top of that when you're doing your digital spend.
Yeah.
I guess another thing is, I hope it goes without saying, but everyone's having a hard time at the moment, you
Yeah.
know? And just showing a bit of compassion and giving some leeway is going to be super crucial. I've really appreciated that in my own workplace, and I try to do that as a leader too. I've heard a lot of companies are switching to 4-day weeks at a 5-day salary. We did summer Fridays at Mozilla for 2 months in July and August, and we saw increased productivity, people reporting higher job satisfaction, we've had lower turnover. So I guess like that kind of reinforces that work is just work, right?
Yeah.
Like it's work. So thinking about that, I guess the rest of life just kind of sucks right now. So
Yeah.
as a business owner or a leader, you should think about what you can do to help your people navigate the bit that you can control, and that's your people's experience at work. And I think we spend most of our waking hours
Yeah.
kind of thrown together in these environments where everyone's struggling and trying to live a normal life. So just a bit of compassion there.
Those are three very powerful lessons. I bet you didn't realize how wise you were, but let me just confirm that those are three really powerful lessons. There's something for me in each one of those. And the first one you mentioned, I find so intriguing and interesting is when some of these early technologies were developed, what would have happened if whoever was developing, doesn't matter, Facebook, Twitter, whatever platform it is. I'm thinking that if when people were inventing these new technologies and platforms, if they actually mapped out what is the best possible outcome for me and my business and the best possible outcome for society, but also plan out what's the best possible outcome for me and the worst possible outcome for society from this business that I'm designing, if perhaps the decisions they made along the way would have been different. And for me, that resonated with me because I believe leaders going forward have to be much better at kind of mapping out various possible scenarios and outcomes for every decision they make. It can be very challenging and complicated to that, but it's so critical to think about multiple possible outcomes and make decisions with the idea that many things could happen here that I don't anticipate.
Yeah, and I think the critical thing is making sure that you're engaging people who are affected by those decisions that you're making,
Absolutely.
and to find out what the effect would be on them and making sure that they're consulted on it.
Absolutely.
It's the thing that's most overlooked,
Yeah.
especially a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is around the development and deployment of technologies that use AI.
Right.
And affected communities, for example, you could be developing a piece of software for doctors to use. And so engineers will be speaking to doctors or other health professionals, but they never talk to patients. And really, what you want to do is increase those outcomes for patients, right? Like you
Right.
want to, and it seems mad that you wouldn't speak to them about like, how do you see this affecting you, or testing it on them. And yeah, I would encourage anybody listening to this to think about those affected communities and how your decisions are going to impact their lives.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, if we can raise a generation of entrepreneurs and business leaders to be thinking these ways, which I'm an optimistic person, so I think we will, hopefully 50 years from now, the world will be a better place than it is today, and it'll only get better.
Well, fingers crossed.
Absolutely. John, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate the way you think about the world and the way you articulate it. And I really appreciate you sharing that with my listeners. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Okay. Have a great day.
You too.
It's incredible the number of times in these episodes that discussion about the influence of teachers comes up. John was no exception. He talked about the impact that Mrs. Mason had on influencing his leadership, right? He specifically referred to her teaching critical thinking and thinking about the why behind things. She taught him understand the cause of mistakes and learn from them. Two lessons that John carried forward in his leadership. And he talked about how he ensures that the teams he's leading understand the why behind things. And he also talked about the importance of providing direction and parameters to your team, but then not micromanaging them. He referenced David Ogilvy, the advertising mogul, and his quote about the freedom of a tightly defined brief. Give your team an understanding of the why from Mrs. Mason, and give them a tightly defined brief sense of the outcome you're seeking and the direction, but then trust them. Let them go. Be there to support them, but don't micromanage. We also talked about the importance in this new virtual way of working of small talk, and how by being an empathetic listener, you can use the power of small talk, not just to connect the team and break the ice, but also find powerful clues as to what's going on with people, what's important to them, what are their values, what matters. And you can use that to strengthen the relationship. But the ultimate golden nugget of this interview was our discussion about trust. John introduced us to something he's learned called the Trust Quotient. On the top of this equation for trust, what is your credibility? What is your reliability? And what is your intimacy? And then you divide that by your degree of self-orientation. So the higher you are in your credibility, the higher you are in your reliability, and the higher you are in your intimacy, the better. And the lower you are in your self-orientation, the better. It's a great mechanism for looking at your relationships. And I've put a link in the episode details to the blog where John writes about this, and I hope you check that out. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, or share it. I want to say thank you to one of my favorite bands, Late Night Conversations, for sharing their song Chaos with me and letting me use it in this episode. You can learn more about them on Instagram at LNC Connected. And here's more of their song Chaos to take you out.
far behind my eyes. Mediation, suffocation, it'll break me. Information in disguise. But when your eyes finally found mine, you were there, but I'm defined by the chaos in my mind. I believe what I perceive is a weave tearing at the seams, and I wonder what's behind. And my ears are bleeding, and the reason easing, the logic of the season, taking the pleasing from my soul and leaving me to die. And I feel the lacing, LNC like racing, unstationary animation taking me